Having said that, let me turn now to our next presenter, the Regulator of the Year, and my good friend MalachiHull from New Orleans. Put a chair for me.
Good afternoon.
So,
if you don't mind, I'm just going to sit here. My name is MalachiHull with the City of New Orleans Taxi Cab and For Hire Vehicle Bureau. I've had the pleasure to serve in 2 major U.S. cities as a regulator. Prior to that, I served as the Director of Sales and Chief Financial Officer for a real estate firm for 9 years in Louisiana. And the main thing, that my focus was on training individuals on how to make sales and how to budget and those type of things. I also have served as a finance officer in the U.S. Army Reserves since 1994. Then one day I get a phone call from Chief Richard Pennington. Chief Pennington served as the Chief of Police in New Orleans. Prior to that, he served in Washington, D.C. as the #2 in command. So he just got appointed to the Chief of Police in Atlanta. And he started to go to business meetings, and they had all these issues in Atlanta with training. So he calls me and says, hey man, I know that you deal with training on a regular basis with the military as well as in your real estate field. How do you feel about coming out here and serving as the Taxi Cab Bureau Director? Because in Atlanta, it fell up under police department. And this was the first police department that he had ever been over where taxi cab and for hire vehicle regulation was there. So I said, okay, well, let me think about it. So I went on and accepted that role, and when I took over in Atlanta, not only did they have training issues, but they had allegations of corruption. So that was some issues that we dealt with there. The first thing that I did was I wanted to develop best practices, so not actually having any type of training in this field, and we talk about it as regulators on a regular basis. When you grow up, you don't say, I want to be a taxi cab regulator. You know, you don't go to school and say, I'm going to be a taxi cab regulator. So I said, let me figure out what some best practices are. So I took over in November of 2002. First place I flew to was in December, was to New York. And I'm sitting in there in a meeting with Commissioner Doss at the time, Matt Doss, who's our president now, and he has his entourage. And if you know Matt always rolls with an entourage. All right, so you're in there and you're talking, and we're just sharing information, and I'm telling Matt the things that I want to do in Atlanta. And it's funny because as I'm talking, Matt is tapping his people, write that down, because I'm saying, well, I think that we can get some federal funds by Homeland Security grants and stuff like that. He's writing these things down. That's what IATR is for, information sharing. That's what we're here to work together for. Then I joined IATR. My first conference was in 2003. Now, you all are in a much civilized IATR. I can tell you. When I first came in, there was hazing. You had guys like Joe Moore. In order to get information, you had to kiss the ring. You had guys like Mike McAllister. In order for you to get information, you had to go running with him early in the morning. You had guys like John Scott. In order to get information from him, you had to walk with him late at night to and from different bars. And then you had Matt Doss. In order to get information from Matt, you had to get up and perform. All right? So that's kind of where the rockin' regulators came from Matt hazing. Then I ended up in New Orleans. When I took over, I served 8 years in Atlanta, and then I came to New Orleans. And when the mayor recruited me, one of the first things that he said he had issues with, you had corruption issues there. You had several investigators who were arrested. You had several high administration folks that were terminated for corruption. You also had issues with age-old vehicles. We didn't have an age limit requirement. One of the fortunate things when I was in Atlanta is they had passed reforms prior to me coming there as far as age limits on vehicles. Now it was my responsibility to enforce it. We implemented some annual training, and we beefed up the training in Atlanta. So when I came to New Orleans, I was kind of seasoned a little bit for that. Took over in June of 2011. And once again, we talked about corruption was an issue. Public perception was an issue. Public perception of the Taxi Cab Bureau. Public perception of the taxi cab industry. Nobody wanted to ride in a taxi cab. Just to kind of give you a little history about our cabs, we also had crime problems. Since 1994, we've had 22 cab drivers killed, victims of homicide. We've had 19 of those since 1996. Since 2007, we've had 5. Now, it gets a little bit worse because just in 2012, we've had 11 incidents, individual incidents, 2012, of drivers either carjacked or victims of armed robbery. Just to top on that, we had 7 alleged sexual assaults of passengers by cab drivers. So we knew that there was an issue there. So when we looked at all these things, and then we had the corruption issue where you had folks getting bribed, accepting bribes. So we came in and we had to figure out how we were going to tackle those things. All the reforms that we just implemented, and we did it fairly in a, now that I think about it, listening to Matt talk last night, we did it in a fairly short period of time. We started in June. All the reforms were passed in April. And we kind of slowed it down just a little bit because we had, change is hard. So you always had groups that are going to sit here and say, we're not engaged. I have a good friend here, Mr. Alan Fisher. Alan used to be the owner of a limousine fleet called London Livery. And let Alan tell it, it was the best in the nation, but they were recognized for their training program. Alan sat in most of those meetings. So almost every meeting that we had, Alan was a part of, and he volunteered, and we appreciate you for that, Alan. So as we went through this process, there were two things that I said I was not going to compromise on. One was credit card systems. We knew that if we implemented cashless systems, we would protect drivers because they would have less cash on them. Most drivers ride around they're moving ATMs. Another issue was driver safety cameras. I said I was not going to back down on those standards because we wanted to make sure the only individuals that had access to that video or to those pictures were law enforcement or the taxi cab bureau. And the only way you can access it, you had to have a police incident number or a taxi cab bureau complaint number. Those were two things that I wasn't going to back down on. And we fought long and hard, and Alan is very aware during those meetings, the industry first, they would say, well, we want access to the video or to the pictures because we want to improve our driver standards. Well, the first thing that they did once we passed the ordinances and they sued, the first thing they said was, you're going to be violating our privacy rights. And we said, no, we're not violating your privacy rights because nobody can access it unless a police incident number's been generated. So we won that battle. Another thing that we had issues with were corruption, so we tackled those where an individual that was caught with bribery, they would be banned for 10 years. We took that from New York. New York had a 3-year ban. So we said we want to get a little bit more serious than New York was, so we said 10 years. Plus, we also have a reporting mechanism in place where if I, as an employee, solicit funds from you as a consumer, you're required to report it to the director, all right? And if you report something to us, then our staff is required to report it as well. So we tried to nip that in the bud. We also had issues with buying of the doors. I'm sure everybody has that issue. And we kind of talked about this a little bit with Uber yesterday, but New Orleans passed a law which was similar to Miami, and I passed it when I was in Atlanta as well, where you can't even stage on a property. You can't even park in a curbside area. You don't have to show compensation, but if you're a prearranged service and you're parked in those curbside, you better have a trip sheet. Because if you don't, you will be cited. And being a part of a police department, you had a lot more enforcement. So several folks' cars were impounded, several folks went to jail for violating that rule. And once you send that message, believe me, it cleaned up real quick. How do we improve the public's perception? That was some things that we're going to continuously be working on, some things that we know we're striving to improve every day, but we know that the public trusts us, and that's the best part about it. Being open and honest with them, showing them everything that we're doing, keeping things in front of them, not hiding things, that's something that I think the public is in favor of. That's some things that I think that as regulators we should all do. The accessible taxi cabs, I know Rosemary talked about that. We tried to figure out what the best practices were for accessible cabs. We also passed ordinances for that. What we said, we watched New York when they were getting sued with the 1% or the 5% of their fleet. We said, well, instead of mandating it to be a part of every fleet, let's develop something where we have accessible cabs where we allow people to volunteer for it. So now you have existing fleet. We're going to set up a separate set of numbers where we're going to make them available to you at a minimum cost, $300. We want you to invest in a vehicle, not in a CPNC or a medallion in order to come in and purchase a vehicle. So we said we're going to give it to you for $300, but the driver must be, the CPNC holder must be the driver. So they cannot lease it, they cannot rent it. That individual must drive the vehicle. So we said we have to figure out a solution where we have a central dispatch company, and we're in the process now of doing that RFP, developing that RFP, so that once that goes out, every cab will be associated, every accessible cab will be associated with that one central dispatch, and all of our cabs are going to be New Orleans Saints gold. I'm a football fan, I love the Saints, but when we talked about Saints Gold, we said, why Saints Gold? That was one of the first questions the mayor asked. I said, it should be the gold standard of taxi cab service because it's accessible. It's a full service cab. It picks up regular fares, it picks up accessible. It's the only one, that's the only way that we can go. And so he bought in on that, so we implemented that. So we have the buying of the doors ordinance. We have new vehicle standards now. That was important as well. And one of the things that we looked at different cities, you have Minneapolis, you have Boston, you have New York. They all require brand new vehicles, straight off the lot, brand new. So we said, I saw something when I was in Atlanta where a bunch of cars from New York were always shipped down to Atlanta. So as soon as you open up for inspections, you see a white cab on the outside, but all the door jambs are yellow, right? So we said, we don't want those raggedy vehicles in New Orleans because Atlanta also had an age limit, but theirs, cars could be placed in service at 5 years. So we put a 5-year timeline in New Orleans as well. Maximum age limit of vehicles is 7 years. That doesn't actually go into effect until January 1, 2014. But what went into effect immediately was vehicles could not be older than 11 model years. So we phased out some of those older vehicles that Rosemary was speaking about, but we actually had older vehicles than she did. You know, we had a LTD. I don't know when they stopped making those, but I know it's been a very long time. So we phased those vehicles out, but we also stopped salvage vehicles from being used as taxi cabs. So if a vehicle was previously used as a law enforcement vehicle, if it was previously used as a taxi cab, if it was previously titled salvage, junk, reconditioned, or whatever, we prohibited those vehicles to make sure that we upgrade our fleet. And I was surprised to see how many vehicles that we had that were salvaged. Now, it's one thing for you to transport your family in your private vehicle. If you don't mind it being salvaged, that's wonderful. But when you're picking up passengers, we think that we need to go above and beyond. And I think that most regulators in here should probably implement those same standards in your jurisdictions because you want to make sure that you ensure public safety. And that's an important part of it. The reason why we went with newer vehicles, what we found out were when you start to go back and look at research, as vehicles become more and more modern, they have higher safety standards. I want to say it wasn't until maybe 1999 when you started having airbags everywhere. So now I started riding a few 2013s since I've been down here, and it's funny because when you see them, they don't just have the side view mirror. They have the little small the magnifier for the blind spots as well. You know, you have side airbags now. Before you just had the one airbag, then you had two airbags. Now you have the curtain airbag. So we think it's all important. Just to sum everything up, as regulators, you have to have passion. I kind of talked about this last night. You have to have passion about doing your job. This is a selfless service job. As public servants, you will not be recognized. So I appreciate what happened last night. If you're in this to be recognized, you're in it for the wrong reason. You're going to get beat up, but as long as we encourage each other as regulators, you know, that's all that you really need to hear. Every time that I have a bad day and I come back, I always have a customer that says, we appreciate what you're doing. We like these standards that you're implementing. That's all that we need is regulators. But you have to have the ability to take risk. We have several individuals that have been terminated from their jobs. I'll tell you, I won't really say the word terminated, but have been forced out of their jobs. Leon Swain talked about his experience yesterday. Cameron, she can talk about her experience, how those folks were after her. I can tell you firsthand, when I was in Atlanta, I didn't get run out of Atlanta, but when I was in Atlanta, those guys used to protest on a regular basis. So as long as you're doing the right thing, it doesn't really matter, all right? So there's a scripture that I like to always focus on. It says, for it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. And I always try and remember that every time. As long as you do the right thing, you have nothing to worry about as far as anything. Thank you.